get started, folks. So today is Wednesday, June 6th. This is a special meeting of the Santa Barbara City Council. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Friedman. Here. Councilmember Dominguez. Here. Mayor Potem Rouse. Here. Councilmember Hart. Here. Councilmember Snedden.
Here.
Mayor Murillo.
Here. Mr. Casey, are there any public comment slips not related to our item? No. Okay, so we'll close the general public comment. And Madam Clerk, will you read our item for tonight?
Item number 2, subject fiscal year 2019 recommended operating and capital budget.
Very good. So, Mr. Casey, we're starting with Mr. Samario.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, council members, Bob Samario, Finance Director. We are going to start first with what we couldn't do on Monday with the city attorney's budget presentation. Then we'll move into and shift over into your discussions and deliberations on the 2019 budget. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Kalan.
Thank you, Mr. Kalan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. First of all, let me thank you for your patience. I was home Monday with a very high fever, unable to function, and so I appreciate you putting this over until today. I want to go through our budget quickly and then turn to a number of questions related to the possibility of adding staff in the office. And there are questions about that. The reason I want to go through the budget quickly is it's relatively unchanged for this year. And if I think, Bob, can you help me? So let's go to the next page.
Ario, I think there's a clicker there for you to be able to use.
It rarely works.
Point it at the screen and it should be fine.
Okay, I'll try. Thank you. All right. Okay, for what I'd like to do is take you back now 2-3 years to try and explain the progression to where we got today. And what you'll find is that last year the office moved from 11 to 13 3/4 positions. 2 3/4 positions were funded to address specific service needs, water resources, airport, wastewater. And we have filled those positions. You'll see in the in very small print on the screen, Dan Henschke joined us as our water lawyer. And so Dan, of course, came to us with 20-plus years experience as general counsel of the San Diego County Water Authority. That's not a 2-room operation in a back shack. That's the Metropolitan Water District of San Diego County. So we were able to move towards adding some specialization into the office. But that's a recurring theme that I want to talk with you about tonight, the difference between generalization and specialization and how that affects efficiency. So moving on. The way we're currently divided up, the balance between advisory work and civil litigation, and those are the 2 areas where we're really producing a product, is more representative of how I'd like it to be than how it really is. One of the significant factors that's affected our ability to produce on time as promised has been the tremendous influx of litigation we've had in the last 18 months. Litigation is deadline and consequence oriented, and it naturally preempts other work in the office. I've tried many different ways to address that. I don't have a perfect solution. I'm not offering that as an excuse for limited productivity elsewhere. It's simply a fact, though, and I know that in my absence yesterday you had a closed session and heard about some of the cases that we have pending. We are extremely busy on the litigation side. So like last year, this 35-40 ratio between litigation and advisory work is probably now more like 45 litigation and 30-ish for advisory. As that advisory time gets compressed, all of those projects sitting in CD, fire, airport end up waiting. And that, unfortunately, has been a continuing trend. So you start to ask yourself why. Well, as I said, we added 2 3/4 positions last year. Water has worked out well. We have an offer out to an investigator. That was the second position. And the investigator's job was 3 parts. Number 1 was to assist with civil litigation, assist with criminal investigations, and follow-ups on things like compliance with vacation rental settlements. And third, to work internally on HR investigations. The individual we've made an offer to is working on a contract basis, but has to reinstate with PERS, and so isn't able to physically join us just yet, but will. So that's our hiring progress. Now, moving on to what we're talking about. Early on in the budget cycle, it became pretty apparent that we have a twofold serious underservice problem. And depending what priority you give, you can rank them how you wish. Number 1, it's clear to me that we are not meeting the needs of community development in particular. Number 2, we are not ahead of the curve on what I would consider code enforcement and criminal prosecution. So let's talk about how these positions relate to those 2 functions. Part of what I have to do is prepare the next generation to replace me. I can't retire until somebody will replace me. So we have individuals like Mr. Doimus and Ms. Ostranger, not in that order, in the audience today who are excellent lawyers. I won't call them young lawyers because that's outdated, but they are excellent lawyers who are very, very experienced at this point and will be the next generation after us. So what I would want to try and do is also train people to develop into difficult positions. So for community development, what we're proposing to do is divide that department and have 1.5 lawyers basically assigned to it, maybe a little more. Right now, Scott Vinson is handling the entire department and can't do it all. Historically, planning or community development has been divided between current planning and advanced planning. A lot of what we're seeing out of Sacramento the last 2 years creates a demand for what I would call advanced planning. In other words, prospective zoning or community development issues that are going to arise. I would propose having Scott handle advanced planning. He understands the structure of the machine. He understands the new zoning ordinance. The department was extremely happy with the work he did with that. He can help add on to and conform that ordinance to the extent we can with this barrage of state laws that want to take your power away, while at the same time on the current planning side, we would add, again, half or more of a person to work their way into planning through the day-to-day work, including work with the boards and commissions. And this is important to understand. We do need to work, in my view, and I've shared this with Mr. Buell and Paul, I think we need to work with our design bodies at a day-to-day level for a little while to try and end up with products that are more concise and reviewable for the Planning Commission and Council. So I've spent time with Ms. Brooke, Mr. Buell, about how we might do that for the ABR, HLC, SFDB. And it's going to take some attorney time and coordination with staff in those design body areas where we wouldn't normally spend a lot of time as lawyers. So that's how we want to attack the planning side of it. On the code enforcement side of it, what we're missing is a full-time, dedicated person who can address both quality of life issues, which I would consider criminal matters, and the code enforcement items that we have. And for a variety of reasons, the time for that position appears to be right. I want to turn it over on that front to Mr. Doimus. John's been working with both the police, the courts, the district attorney's office, public defenders around this solutions court concept, and I think he has information that would be important for you to hear.
Mr. Doimus, Mr. Dominguez has a question.
Before you jump in, I want to ask about the headline there, the new staffing follow-up to council inquiry. Which council inquiry are you referring to?
There were a number of you, including yourself, that asked how we might make a more effective punch at code enforcement. And so Mr. Casey and I went back and looked at that in combination with the questions about not only meeting the goals for CD, but our performance in meeting those goals. And this is the response.
So this isn't a response to a formal council, either an agenda memo or a council vote directing staff?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all.
So how would you characterize it then? Because I was under the impression that would be the way you would bring a staffing request to us if we asked for it. Is this a different mechanism for bringing this here, or what's the background?
Well, I think that the way the charter works, the city administrator is obligated to propose a budget that he feels comfortable with. This is an alternate recommendation that we would both be comfortable with if the council wishes to go that way. I think it's advisable, but it is purely a choice for the city council against a lot of competing priorities, and I recognize that.
Okay.
So no formal direction to do this.
Okay, I just wanted to cross my T and dot my I.
Sure.
You know, I'm definitely someone in favor of code enforcement, having spent some time doing it myself personally. So, but I just wanted to straighten up when it says council inquiry, particularly for our new council members. I wanted to make sure they had the background to put this into context. So it's less of a council inquiry, more of a budgetary move on your part?
Yes, in terms of code enforcement, the specific issues that have been dangling are vacation rentals and increasing street crime. We can't allow our public spaces to be lost, and unless we have some steady resources there, I worry that could happen. But let me turn it over to
And
Mr.
Madam Mayor,
Gomez.
Councilmember Dominguez, if I could just follow up. I do feel it is in response, though, to Council's question on the housing side, joint meeting with the Planning Commission and others about how can we move forward the policy work that Council is interested in. And that's why you saw in the community development budget, we brought forward some recommendations about adding some staff to be responsive. This is the city attorney portion of that as well. This isn't budgeted, so it's not in our recommended budget, so it will require kind of council action, but I felt an obligation to be responsive to that inquiry and request from pretty much all of you, I think, at the joint meeting of give us an option of if we wanted to staff up to be more responsive, what would it take? And that's our response to that.
Right. And I understand that as a general principle, I wanted to know if it was a capital I interest or a lowercase I interest, just so we know whether it was a council directive or you were bringing it to us as a staff initiated action.
I would say
There's important differences that flow from whether it's one or the other, so I just wanted to make sure we're starting this presentation knowing it's one versus the other. And often they can be both, something that staff's initiating, but everyone up here wants, but there's a technical difference if we've asked for it with a council agenda memo or we vote. I mean, I'm assuming there is, but if you don't think there's a distinction.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, no, you did not take a 4 council member vote. If you had done so, I might have included it in the base budget and presented it as part of the recommended budget.
Okay.
I do feel I had pretty clear direction from all of you to look at and give you options to consider, and that's what we're doing tonight. It is
Okay.
presenting you an option to consider. You can choose to fund it or not.
Got it. So it's a staff-initiated presentation.
I know you're trying to claim that that's the case. I do feel I'm trying to be responsive to council guidance and direction at the joint council and planning commission meeting about staff. Can you bring back some options about how we can be more responsive on the housing policy that you all are very interested in? So I feel I'm trying to be responsive to your needs. I don't think I'm doing that in a vacuum. I try to listen to your guidance and direction and interest and try to be responsive to that. If I'm missing the boat on that, I apologize, but I feel that that is
Well, this
what
is
I'm
definitely
trying to do.
responsive to our needs, but that's not the question. So, thank you.
Mr. Hart?
Would it be helpful if I made a motion to have staff bring forward a proposal to do code enforcement? Not necessary? Okay. I think we need to let the presentation go forward so we can get the information. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Hart. I also think there's a lot of concern about vacation rental out there. We can't, it's something that needs to be addressed, and that's obvious. And from our discussion about amendments to the AUD, that's very much attorney work. So, but I appreciate the discussion, and we'll go to Mr. Doimus. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, Assistant City Attorney John Doimus, thank you for this opportunity. I want to first briefly explain what the city attorney's code enforcement and criminal prosecution, I wouldn't call it division, but at least what we can do and have been doing. And then I want to segue into why we would want to increase such service and the value to the community and what such increase would look like. So I think that's probably the direction I will go with this. So code enforcement or criminal prosecution works in terms of protecting the quality of life of the citizens of Santa Barbara. And we get our authority to do so in the municipal code and the adopted state laws in the municipal code. So for example, any regulatory codes in the municipal code or anything adopted like the state building codes, the fire codes, the zoning ordinance, those all give us the legal authority to enforce on any issues of violations in the city. It also includes taxing authority in terms of transient occupancy taxes that aren't paid by either hotels and all that to enforce on that. So those are at least the authority. That is the wide range we can at least prosecute and enforce on either civilly or criminally or both. I don't know what slide. So the goal in terms of this is one of the ways we're looking at this I'll start with a criminal point of view. One of the ways we're looking at this is solutions court, as Ariel talked about. That is these quality of life crimes that are being committed, having a partnership at the table. When I say that, is a partnership with the district attorney's office, with the courts itself, with the public defender's office, with probation, with mental health, all in engaging in a solutions court. What does that mean? Generally speaking, a lot of these crimes are low-level misdemeanor crimes. And traditionally what happens is their misdemeanors are issued, the jails are overcrowded, these cases get disposed out. Many times the defendants are there for an arraignment date, they don't show up, a bench warrant is issued, they spend one day in jail, and they're out the next day. And they're out the next day whether it's a location of a park, continuously drinking at a park, or causing crime in a certain area. Solutions Court is to put a stop to that. How? By educating the judges, the prosecutors, being either the city attorney's office who will be in that courtroom or the district attorneys, by also educating the public defender, recognizing that their clients are continuous repeat offenders. How do you get to the root of the problem? How do you get to the solution in terms of keeping individuals from committing continuous crimes? It's also having engagement with mental health, probation as well, to get the services they need. So it's kind of a carrot stick. The carrot is we have someone there. You have a list of accumulated violations, whether they be penal code from the district attorney's office or they be municipal code from our office. And it is basically kind of in terms of you either get the help you need, whether it be mental health, drug abuse, alcoholism, or if not, face criminal consequences. If there's a large accumulation, there could be mean jail time. Other remedies can include injunctive relief. What does that mean? For example, as I said earlier, if they're at a park continuously, maybe injunctive relief from being at that park if they're continuously committing crimes in that area or other areas in the city, which then prevents other citizens from enjoying going to the park. But it's at least a central hub in the court system, and the court willing to commit resources to deal with this issue. The district attorney is willing to commit resources to deal with this issue. We feel our office, in a partnership with all these other agencies, that we want to commit the resources ourselves as a city to do these issues by being in the courtroom, dealing with chronic offenders, and trying to find a solution to this problem, and mainly to prohibit crimes from occurring, get the treatment that these individuals need, and if not, criminally prosecute.
John, thank you. Madam Mayor, members of the council, a lot of people have put a lot of effort into re-upping our effort to address really the downtown quality of life problems forcefully and humanely by compelling people into treatment in a much more aggressive way. We need to be participating. We've had brilliant work from the police doing this work, but we need to be there. We really need to be involved. And again, the deterrent value, as John said, has to do with not only getting people help, but also getting the injunctive power for our police to get people to move from areas where they're being disruptive. So that's on the quality of life side. On vacation rentals, the council's tried to address that by giving us one-time blocks of money. And that's been $80,000 twice in 15 and 16 and 17, actually 3 times. And that money has been used largely in defense of lawsuits against the city rather than any affirmative prosecution. I attempted without success to hire someone on a contract basis. I really don't think that we can have someone functioning as a prosecutor without them being focused, experienced, and full-time in that role. So that's the basis for that. Now, quickly, I know you've got plenty to do tonight. You can see that the budget numbers are not particularly compelling. It's a small reduction this year. Now, what I'd really like to talk about are the handouts I gave you, and there are 2. The first is the 8.5 by 11 piece that's entitled City Attorney's Office Hourly Rate Analysis.
Go ahead.
Before you leave the code enforcement section, are you doing any more on that, or can I ask a question on that now?
No, please go ahead.
So you mentioned this is a new strategy to work as partners with the DA, probation, public defender. Have we spoken to them?
Mr. Doimus?
Yes, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, yeah, we've had several meetings already in the implementation of this, both here in South County and North County in terms of that, so yes.
And you're talking about the restorative justice component?
Yes, but at a larger scale. The hard part with the restorative justice component, right, we have right now is that it requires police officers to be in that courtroom, and police officers in that state shouldn't be there. It should be the lawyers being in there, manning the courtrooms with the judges working on this, and also it allows us to have a larger intake, and so an increase in prosecution, a larger intake will help in terms of prosecuting more cases or getting people more help that they need.
And so the DA is on board with assigning a DA to this increased caseload?
Yes, in fact, District Attorney Joyce Dudley has hired or has had someone come from out of retirement, Gordon Ausencloss, to work specifically on this project with us. So they are fully engaged in this.
And the PD's ready to assign more person power to this?
Well, that's a good question. The goal is try not to have police power dealing with this. This is in terms of, yes, they can cite the offenders, find the offenders, cite it, and testify in court if it comes to that in terms of criminal prosecution. But the goal is to have actually the lawyers and the judges and the public defender work on dealing with this issue and not having police manpower this, because as they do right now in the restorative court, because it's the police officers down there, and so they need to be out there patrolling the areas versus being in the courtroom.
Sitting in a jury room waiting to be called into court.
Exactly, correct.
And I know recently with Prop 47, the DA has, I'm not sure if our particular DAs, but statewide, they've complained that they've lost the tools to pressure this category of individual into drug rehab programs or halfway homes. So has something changed to make this more realistic? A lot of these misdemeanors are now being charged as infractions. Felonies that were felonies before are now being charged as misdemeanors. What gives you the confidence we can actually get results when people have been saying they no longer have the tools?
Two things I think that give me the confidence. Number one is what has occurred in restorative court and the success of that, but taking it at a much larger scale right now. But also it's the courts also willing to give the resources. The judges, meeting with them, wanting to give the resources to this as well. They are key in this. And the other agencies, we've met in these meetings with mental health, with probation, with public defender. So that's what gives, at least me personally, the confidence to do so. And that is why we're encouraging, we want to be more of a presence in this too as well, because they want to partner with us on this.
And I know Judge Maxwell and some of the courts that have been involved have done amazing work in this county. What are the numbers we've had in the past? How many cases have we been filing per month? And what is it you anticipate doing if we adopt this?
The numbers I can recently give is 22 cases in the last month and a half. I don't know if I can project in terms of give you a numerical value of, but it will increase. But in terms of reviewing a significant amount increase, but I don't want to mislead and give a number that I really can't.
Do you guys have a goal?
Again, that'd be really hard to give in terms of the goal is an improvement.
Well, if you're doubling your personnel, would doubling that number be realistic?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, I think it would be too low. Mr. Doimus performs a wide array of duties. If I have somebody dedicated with a legal assistant, with an investigator, I think the caseload goes up faster than in a linear way. So I am both Ms. Ostringer and Mr. Doimus are those lawyers that are about 90 because they probably bill 3,000 hours a year. Having said that, we've got to be able to triple what we're doing now. Now, please remember that when we came last time for staffing and when the council authorized the office space expansion across the street, we did it on a 3-year trial basis. And so in my mind, we have until 2020 when the city has to bite the bullet on that office space expansion to show that we can make these numbers work. On the non-criminal code enforcement side, there are significant cost recovery mechanisms that we'll be using, including the newly enacted attorney's fees language that you gave us several weeks ago, where when we choose to invoke it, we can recover our attorney's fees if we prevail. But we're not exposed to attorney's fees unless we choose to invoke that clause to recover our own. So we are looking for, and I believe Mr. Samario and Mr. Casey have assumed substantial cost recovery. There's no way I can guarantee it to you, but I can promise you can pull the plug in 2020 or sooner if you would like to, if we can't demonstrate. So this kind of feeds back to Councilmember Friedman's request back early on, I think our first meeting, with an analysis of our outside counsel expenses. So when you're finished with code enforcement, I want to shift to those kinds of numbers too, so I can explain how I judge our efficiency and how we can improve that judgment with different data.
Yeah, and is it fair that I'm asking these numerical questions? I don't want to be,
It's absolutely fair. What you're doing is teaching me what information you need to make decisions.
Okay.
So it's perfectly fair.
So if it's safe to say then we're getting about 20 cases a month going to restorative court over the last year?
That's a high number. No, we
Okay.
had, there has been an invigorated enforcement in the last, 6, 8 weeks.
Oh, yeah, 6, 8 weeks, correct.
The chief can explain more, and we're looking to continue that because we're starting a busy tourist season. Who knows, it'll be everything from scooters to unhoused people that we're going to be dealing with.
Okay, and is that part of the presentation, or is that something you're saying she can if we want her to? The chief can explain more in terms of personnel?
If you would like information on how those 20-plus cases came about, the chief can explain. I think John can.
I can as well.
John,
I'll
go
be
ahead.
more than happy to.
Mr. Doimus, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez. We wanted to make more of a presence. So right now we focused on the parks, the State Street corridor, and we've seen stuff like drinking in public or other crimes to charge them as misdemeanors. And I've gone to arraignment court. The majority of the defendants have not shown up, but the judges have been very cooperative, issuing bench warrants for such serious crimes. Those that have, we've already kind of started a minor version of Solutions Court. One individual agreed to 20 AA meetings and do community service. So the genesis of this is just to focus on an area in the city in terms of the State Street corridor, the parks, and then with the goal of having additional staff is to expand it further and further. And with that expansion, I can imagine an increase in cases being filed.
So, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Dominguez, at the tail end of the last meeting I was at, the concern was about efficiency and are we slow? Why are we slow is the question. And you have to ask that every day. We are slow right now. And to my mind, put in a very simple way, it's this. When I was in private practice, I handled fewer matters per day. What happens to us is that we handle more matters per day than is typical and can give less attention to each matter. That's number one. So as you shift gears from project 1 to project 2, there's a little bit of friction. And the more stop-starts you do during the day, the more time you lose. So what lawyers do for efficiency is to specialize as they get more expertise. And then their hourly rate goes higher, but it takes them less time to research and conquer any individual project. So lawyer X might be worth X dollars an hour, or I'm worth X minus 10 because I don't have that expertise. Now, that works very well when you're in a firm that has more people than departments your client has. Let me say it again. If I had an office where I didn't have to have anybody split between multiple departments, I promise they could be more efficient because Ms. Ostranger would be the expert on FAA and know nothing else. We can't do that realistically with a city our size, but we're trying to approximate it in areas where it makes sense. So again, I mentioned Mr. Henschke. We hired an expert. We have Mr. Vincent. He is an expert. We're going to focus him. We have Ms. Ostranger. She is well on her way to being a land use expert with the experience in cannabis that you've seen. And what we want is an expert who's going to focus on quality of life and code enforcement. So I've looked at everybody's resumes. I watched their work. They're not lazy. The only efficiency thing I can think of in a macro sense is that the city's leave policies are relatively generous, but we factor them in on this piece of paper. So let me try and explain what this is about.
Okay. Thank you.
And I can do this quickly. You'll see two columns. One says total comp, one says fully overhead burdened. Now, total comp is salary plus benefits. And so that would be similar to the number that administrative services would use in their salary survey. The fully overhead burdened number came as a request to finance because from my standpoint, a law firm would have to pay for a copier and office space and furniture and all of that stuff, which would not be included if you looked only at our salary and benefits. So the fully burdened number here, in my case, $270 an hour, takes into account the cost of the office space across the street and the furniture and everything that goes with it. Now, these numbers, $270 an hour is, I would say, low-mid range. It's not cheap. None of our rates are in the cheap range anymore. So what that does is it tends to make the choice between inside lawyers and outside lawyers a little closer. Because if I have a generalist and can offer you a discount, but it's going to take that generalist twice as long as a specialist who won't cost twice as much, I'm better off using the specialist. Now, I've been candid about my bias there, and that leads to the next spreadsheet, which is the response to Councilmember Friedman. This is a shorthand, non-privileged look at our spending on outside law firms over the last several years. The main column I want you to take a look at is the far right annual expenditure, right next to column 1. And what you'll see there is that our outside counsel expenditures have grown, thanks Bob, have grown significantly, but they appear to be stabilizing at least this last year. And you've heard me many times say that there are 4 times when I want to use outside lawyers when it's in the city's interest. Number 1, when it's a specialty, it doesn't make sense to develop in-house. So in the case of Latham and Watkins, we paid $750 an hour for specialized coastal commission expertise that I could never replace. So we'll hire outside for specialized expertise, for marquee talent on a case we got to win. That was Roland Jacks. We'll hire outside when we have a conflict of interest. That's Proctor & Shire in the Leyva matter. Our office had a conflict. And finally, there's overflow. And a number of these projects are related to overflow work. So what I'm seeing is a history of some increase in outside counsel expenditure with some stabilization. What I worry about, what I don't have the full answer for, is how much is enough. I would like to have happy clients who give me good ratings on my customer service survey. I don't know how many lawyers it will take to get there to do that. What Mr. Casey and I are agreed upon is that you really add permanent staff judiciously and carefully. So the recommendation today, or the option today, really needs to be looked at for what it is. I think it's the right thing to do. I would recommend it if I were asked, but I wouldn't make that recommendation and without knowing that we can pull the plug before we have to commit to that office space across the street for 10 years in 2020. So that's really all I had to say. I would like to ask Ms. Ostranger to come up and talk about where we planned to go with the day-to-day land use work, just to let you know how we intended to approach the boards and commissions.
Thank you. Ms. Ostranger?
Good evening, Madam Mayor, council members. Tava Ostranger, Assistant City Attorney. The approach we'd like to take is to look at our design boards, ABR, Single Family Design Board, and give them sort of a checklist that they can mark off when they're making decisions that are code-based. Does this project satisfy this? Make a little comment for a finding. And as they go through, that establishes a record that will give the Planning Commission information to make decisions. And so it's not more of a bubble, and we think it'll streamline the whole process to make it quicker and easier for the Planning Commission.
And would that prevent appeals, or
Well,
is
nothing
the
can
goal?
prevent appeals.
Okay.
But we hope it provides a better record to establish the staff's decision. And it also will give, in the long run, these kind of documents would require less attorney review. So what we'd like to do to start out is have one of the assistant city attorneys sit with the design review boards at their commission hearings, which is not something we've done in the past unless it's a significant issue that needs legal advice. So they've been operating without council guidance at their meetings, and in this case they would have some guidance and they could look to legal advice. So if there is a legal issue that needs to be addressed, it's not addressed in the appeal, it's addressed there at the hearing.
Okay. Questions from Ms. Ostringer? Mr. Okay. Well, I did have a question. I feel like you've made your case, but where would the money come from? That's coming? Okay. I mean, some of these issues are enterprise departments.
Okay, so are you,
That's my presentation, Madam Mayor, members of the council. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Colon. Mr. Dominguez, you have a question at this point?
Yeah, I wonder if we could invite the chief up to hear about the change in the department's use of resources, or what's led to this difference in enforcement activity and what we're looking at in the future.
Thank you, Chief Luno.
Madam Mayor, Council, we've been trying to manage issues, as you know, to keep some of these nuisance-related crimes and issues for the community under control. So we've tried what we can within the scope of our current staffing by adjusting hours, doing more camp cleanups and whatnot, and really trying to find things that allow us the opportunity to enforce. So we've been working on this solutions court idea. I want to say we, because we were at the table a year and a half ago. And I think what presented, and I may be corrected, was the fact that we have these constant offenders that don't fit the restorative model, and there was a need for this extra class, the solutions court. So a lot of it was recognizing that the court is what's generating or not allowing us to have a final impact because there was a lack of knowledge on the extent of the problem. So I don't see so much any change in how we've been doing business on the front end. We've constantly adjusted and tried to manage our resources based on problems as they present. But I think what the greatest benefit from this is getting the result of recognizing that somebody, and I know the DA's office had a spreadsheet on some of these clients that have had hundreds of citations. The problem is I think the recognition and the option for the court system to do something with them has been reduced to a day served because they were picked up on a warrant and the cases have been cleared. So the recognition of what their true problem wasn't as apparent. And I know that's not a direct answer that you were looking for as far as how we're spending our resources differently. I think it's the bigger question of how can we be more impactful with how we do display them.
Well, it's definitely a direct answer. And to go back to last year when we were having a conversation with you about, for example, downtown, and we were trying to discuss more patrolling, and so we did have a more impactful patrol downtown, just more hours and more people for several weeks or a few months. Is that what happened?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, yes, we restructured the organization and we have the capacity now, I think, to identify the problems. This is a tool to help get us to a different place because we have adjusted, we've modified, streamlined our organization as a whole. So the communication's there, people are working together, we're adjusting accordingly.
And then you have the resources to support this in terms of the arrests and citations that will be made. They're talking about at least 20 a month, but maybe triple that, so 60 a month.
Absolutely. And my opinion is we are writing a lot of those citations, and where the lack of impact comes is the 20 or so that may get pushed forward to the court system just get dismissed without an actual system in place to support it. So whether it gets dismissed earlier on or gets lumped together with a day served because a warrant actually went to jail,
So why are they not going to just come out of the system in a day with the same judges in the same courts? What's going to change?
I believe it's a commitment to this new court. We're calling it Solutions Court. So it's a program that the entire criminal justice system is agreeing that there's a need here. They're spinning their wheels in regards to seeing these clients over and over again. And it's trying the same restorative approach, if you will, but with the other options to get them to some treatment courts, and the commitment to say, hey, don't dismiss all those citations. Let's send them here first to see if we can actually get them into some treatment.
Okay.
May I look at Mr. Doimus to see if I was on track with that?
No, that's great.
Okay.
And I'm just asking all these questions because we haven't been formally presented with any of this information. So, and I know we're trying to squeeze it in, but it's just a tough call because it's a lot. And to hear that there's all these agencies involved, it's just a lot for us to take, without hearing this. So
yes, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, it's the DA's office that took the lead, and people are at the table recognizing that this is a need. We have I think a white paper that pretty much explains it that I could definitely get out to you all so you could see more. But frankly, it's not going to take any more resources from us. It's going to be a solution that we're hopefully not going to see the same people over and over or have our hands tied with no true help being assigned.
great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, Mr. Fried?
And then bringing the question back to the city attorney. So how much of that new FTE will be doing this criminal enforcement versus how much will that person be doing the civil enforcement?
The criminal position criminal versus civil, quality of life versus, I don't know. I'm imagining that the criminal cases will be maybe less creative than the civil cases and less time consuming. So I think it will be easier to handle those. I think the civil cases, particularly in the vacation rental area, involve evidence issues that can be challenging. That's some of what we have investigators for. So I couldn't give you an exact split. If I had to guess, I would say it's going to lean a little bit on the code enforcement rather than quality of life side. So maybe 65-35 is my initial guess.
So you're talking 50%, criminal code enforcement? Because when you say quality of life, that's the criminal side?
Yes, and
okay.
Code enforcement, I'm thinking of building code,
okay.
housing code, structural work, so that's the terminology. I think one of the challenges here that goes with this money, should the council wish to fund it, is the responsibility to develop some kind of meaningful metrics. The performance targets are very challenging, but obviously I think we're going to have to look at a very granular level, like each client, so to speak, each defendant, and have a way to track them through. So that's where we are.
Thank you.
And I think that's why I'm having trouble is just trying to see what the performance metrics are, because I want to give you this opportunity to prove this program's worth, but without a set of goals or outcomes in hand. We don't let grant applicants come to us without telling us very specifically what they're attempting to achieve. So not knowing whether you're hiring this person for the quality of life or criminal issues is hard, Because are you hiring someone who's a criminal law specialist, who's a former prosecutor, or are you hiring someone who's a building enforcer?
No, I'm absolutely looking for a professional prosecutor, and I'm actually looking for insulation of that individual from the political process. I don't think I have an ethical issue, but I have some concern at times that my relationship with the council can make it difficult to have prosecutorial decisions that appear spot on. So what I'm envisioning is a relatively powerful position that would be able to make these decisions independently, meaning an added layer of protection from political influence. I could make promises, but they would be out of school, so I'm not going to do it. I appreciate your concern.
And can I ask regarding the numbers on the building code enforcement?
I can back into it this way. We have somewhere over 100 settlements on vacation rentals. John, why don't you come up and help me on these numbers?
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, we have over, at last check, over 100 settlement agreements or signed declarations on vacation rentals where they've also paid any transient occupancy taxes that were due. Currently, we have anywhere between 8 and 10 filed cases in civil court in terms of civil enforcement for building code violations or zoning violations. So that's right now what's in the queue for the civil side.
And what do you think that will turn into with this new personnel?
I think that number could at least double. I'm pretty confident saying that. And also, it allows for flexibility on the power slide we had in terms of remedies. It allows for more frequent filings of receiverships if need be. I even had up there a powerful remedy, drug abatement action too, that could lead to at least, and that's a very labor-intensive endeavor. And drug abatement actions are where you have a drug house, and that allows the governmental entity to find all the people who are hanging out there, as well as take the property, not turn it back over to the owner. Actually, take it, have it sold to someone else, and any of the leftover proceeds going back to the person the home was confiscated. Obviously, it's a strong remedy, but at least having a dedicated code enforcer and prosecutor allows us to have flexibility on anything that happens in terms of, including marijuana shops in terms of prosecuting there if they're not filing of the permits. So there's plenty of issues out there I could foresee dealing with.
Yes, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez. One thing I wanted to mention when we were talking about code enforcement is we now have the commercial cannabis business ordinance, and we're going to be seeing some unpermitted actors that are there. We're already seeing illegal deliveries being made in the city, so that's not something we've had the resources to deal with, but I think because we've taken the steps to go through the process, the significant process of permitting certain marijuana dispensaries, we're going to want to also take the stand to get the bad actors out and the unpermitted actors, and that's something that we haven't done in the past, but I foresee us needing to do, and that's going to take some significant staff time, which will be both on, it can be both on the civil side with injunctions. If we've got a business like a manufacturing operation that's operating in a specific location, we can do an injunction where we can go after the property owner and the business. Or if it's a delivery service that's not a fixed base operator, we may want to go with the commercial or the criminal aspect in that case. So that's just one thing we're looking at with regards to amping up this code enforcement.
And just to piggyback on Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, so I can't give you a production number, but when I come at it the other way, I know what I do know, which is without the position, the only way I'm going to address CD is to hire private firms, and on the quality of life and code enforcement side, I'm not going to be able to do much of anything. The budget has been consistent, anywhere from 0.9 to maybe 1.1 FTE in that area. So knowing that we can't do any more with what we have, suggests that unless we are completely inefficient and working 25% below capacity, we can use this help. But
I understand this entire, you're saying you're really busy now and you can't do more unless you have more people. That's implied. I just want to get some numbers, what we can expect. I think that's just a fair question. Maybe what we can do, are you tracking cases with software? Could you just send us like the last 12 months, what the monthly load is on the code enforcement and the quality of life, just so we can have an idea?
sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Friedman and then Ms. Snedden.
So I just wanted to clarify for myself so I understand correctly, going back for the Solutions Court and the conversation the item we had about a month ago when we were reviewing your annual metric data, and part of that conversation was that the outcomes that the police are trying to achieve new outcomes and get to the root of the problem. And it seems to me that this is the missing piece to that we didn't have that conversation at that time, but this is where we need to go. It's what will make it effective and will get you where you need to be based on the conversation we had here at council. So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding that correctly.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Friedman, I'm not going to say this is our answer, but this helps us get down the road.
So yeah, so
It
so
takes
it's
a
one
bite
of the,
out
one
of
of the
it.
tools that you need to get there, to move it forward and basically change those outcomes that you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely.
And then I did have a question for the city attorney on this. So how does this fit into the issue of when we had the joint meeting with the Planning Commission on the proposed hybrid approach to funding new work projects? And I understand we need to have additional staff from your office to help with those. How does this fit into these positions, or do these new positions free up your staff to work on those? I just want to make sure that do we have these, and then we also have to consider more for you to do this hybrid approach that we're funding? I'm a little confused on how that gets funded.
Okay, that's a very good question. So the time that gets changed around is Ms. Ostranger becomes part of the community development team in addition to some other duties. So we're looking at roughly half her time there. That's going to impact Public Works. Mr. Henschke's there to pick up some of that in the medium term. Mr. Doimus is also going to have time freed because rather than running the quality of life and code enforcement, he'll be training somebody and then letting that unit go. So I'll have two people who are freed up roughly equivalently to what this new lawyer will be doing. Again, the place where I feel some vulnerability is in Public Works, and I haven't got a full solution there. There's another issue with Public Works that we are working on internally. We know that the taxpayers have asked you to spend a lot of money over the next 20 years. We definitely don't want to be a bottleneck on that process. So we've been looking at it very closely to make sure that we're able to keep up with the engineers on all of those projects. That's a work in progress. So the answer is, I think we're okay, but we may end up with a shortfall in Public Works. Conceivably, think about that as being normal when you have a massive infrastructure plan facing you for 20 years.
So based on this is on the council direction to add those extra work projects, and then we did look at the community development to take those on. This is the approach that you said to be able to do that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Ms. Snedden and then Mr. Hart.
Thank you. I just really want to thank you for bringing this forward. I think just in the 6 months that I've been here, we've been asking for solutions for addressing our homeless population and restorative needs there, and short-term rental enforcement and those needs, and code enforcement in general, and community development. We've also, I think, all noticed that we're falling short in that department in some ways. And I think this is exactly the kind of thing that I would look for, is solutions to come forward to in responsiveness to all of these issues that we've been bringing up over the time. And I'm especially excited about Solutions Court and really looking forward to hearing more about that. I think it's really something big we've been looking for, and it's exciting. And I did have the question about policy work, and I think Councilmember Friedman addressed that. So thank you.
Thanks. Councilmember Hart?
Yeah, I just want to make sure this is clear, is that you're proposing these additional positions to be 100% paid for by cost recovery.
That's what we think. Yeah.
And so the only question that I've had, because, I'm completely supportive of everything you've said. I think, if we were to take a vote, it'd probably be unanimous. Why not more? If it's 100% cost recovery, why wouldn't you have two people to do this? Two more people to do this?
It's hard enough going from 11 to 13 and 3/4, and now going to 15 and 3/4. We figured that space across the way was good for 16 to 18, and it's been very disruptive, what we've gone through the last year. So it's as much as I can swallow and continue functioning. We'll have a discussion when we do my performance evaluation, but this has not been an easy year administratively for me. So that's something we'll discuss at an appropriate time.
Okay, so looking forward then, potentially next year, you could add another person. Because the limitation isn't the amount of work that needs to be done. The limitation isn't the resources to provide it. It's managing it, rolling it out, and integrating it into what your current workload is, rather than traditionally what we're struggled with is resources. That's what usually limits our ability to put people toward a problem, to solve it.
Yes, but I think there's a shared value to build on some success here.
Yeah, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Hart, that'd be my reaction too, is just let's have proof of concept that it is going to pay for itself, and if it does and it's successful and we've got the capacity to expand, I would recommend doing it incrementally and make sure it's working for us.
That is very reasonable, and I understand that completely. But I think that, my sense of it is that it will be very successful because the problem is very large, and you have good, excellent people to do this work. And so, let's go.
Thank you. Mr. Rouse?
Yeah, great. I spent a little bit of time talking to Mr. Auchincloss as well as Joyce Dudley and a couple of retired judges about this. And everyone's excited about a concept that could help break the cycle. And doing the same thing over and over again for years hasn't really proved as fruitful. This is a way to maybe help and create a new dynamic that'll eventually get us to progress in what we want to do in the first place. So it's one of our biggest problems we have in the city. So I'm 100% supportive.
Thank you. And I'll add that I've seen an uptick in complaints about service-resistant street people, and our Chuck Reed in the yellow shirt goes and talks to someone who's drinking himself to death. It falls on deaf ears. The AmeriCorps outreach teams from Home for Good, these are people who don't respond to a traditional social service scenario. So I think what you're talking about is something where they're forced into services. So I support that. Mr. Dominguez is right that we do need some performance measures, and however you all want to put that together, please let us know. The public too wants to know that our city attorney's office is being effective. So thank you. We'll let it go. I don't see any speaker slips. Mr. Samario, something?
Yeah, so we'll move on sort of to the main part of the today's meeting. So we're going to be asking you to make decisions today. We're hoping to wrap the budget process up today, and then we'll be adopting the budget scheduled for 2 weeks from now, so on June 19th. The presentation that I have is pretty tight. It's, we have some decisions to make, primarily some adjustments that have been made since the budget was filed in April, but I think we can get there pretty quickly. So again, back in late April, the city administrator, Mr. Casey, submitted his recommended budget that was kind of alluded to earlier. We had 6 public hearings, and the whole point of those hearings is to have departments present to you what they're recommending and understanding their operations, and it's also for the benefit of the public, and they get to weigh in as well. And then we have the Finance Committee always review certain aspects of the budget, not repeating what the council, full council hears, but focusing on things like fees, capital, and things like that. So the goals today are to go through the Finance Committee's recommendations. A little different this year in that the Finance Committee was really tasked to look at all the adjustments. Typically, there's sort of this defined set of things they look at, and then the council kind of decides on other things. But this time, everything kind of was funneled through the Finance Committee, which in some ways made it for a more efficient process. So, the body of what they're going to recommend to you, that's almost the entire body of what you're going to be looking to decide on today. So you'll weigh on those recommendations, and then we'll open it up. If there's anything else that we hadn't covered that you heard during those presentations from the departments, we're welcome to hear your input in any direction. So the things that the Finance Committee recommended council approval on include the general fund revenue assumptions that very important. What are the assumptions for next year's revenues, primarily tax revenues? And there's some uncertainty there, but they went through those and supported staff's recommendations. We had a couple of minor adjustments to the budget since it was filed, and those were recommended for approval as well. And then unanimously, the committee recommended the fee adjustments for both general fund and enterprise funds, and it did include a $500 impound fee for abandoned scooters. We will be discussing this more in a couple of weeks. I think staff feels like $500 for the scooters, it might be a bit much for us to support from a Prop 26 perspective. It has to be tied to cost, but they have some other alternative approaches that they're going to talk to you about in a couple of weeks. And then separate from the additional staff that community development talked about for project work, they have proposed, and you heard the addition of staff to basically turn around plan checks more quickly. And they proposed 1.5 FTE that would be funded from increased fees. And so you heard that discussion, and that was also supported by the Finance Committee. And then there's a 3-0 recommendation to approve partial funding for the request from Visit Santa Barbara. They requested $150,000 one-time money to do some expanded marketing, particularly down in the South Coast area or LA area or Southern California in light of the Thomas Fire and the debris flow. And the committee recommended to split that $100,000 between the general fund and the waterfront fund. And incidentally, the Visit Santa Barbara, as requested by the committee, has secured additional money, other money, $20,000 from other agencies, which they can speak to if you like. And then the committee also asked just to bring back information from either city staff or Visit Santa Barbara on how much each jurisdiction is generating in terms of TOT, to give some context to that. And so I did work with them, and they provided the information this pie chart was built on. So this shows you the TOT revenues in the South Coast. So far right, we're the largest in terms of how much TOT revenues we generate, $20.8 million. That does include the additional 2% that we get for under Measure B that goes for creeks. So that's not just the general fund portion. And then to the top left, you can see the county districts 1 through 3. I think it's a good thing to kind of show, and that's about $10 million, about half of what we get. Buellton, 1.9 million, Solvang, 4.3, Carb, about 1.9, and then Goleta, because they have added a number of hotels lately, they're at $8.6 million. So again, we are the lion's share, but this gives you sort of a sense of, in the context of Visit Santa Barbara and all the marketing they do, these are the sort of the agencies that benefit from that effort. Council also approved, the committee also recommended approving on a 2-to-1 vote, adding a full-time Spanish-speaking public outreach position. As you know, we have currently a part-time hourly position. There's $20,000 budgeted for that in the fire department. The position would cost, on a net basis, counting that $20,000, $99,000, again, on a full-time basis. And then there were some adjustments that have been proposed to the general fund capital program that's funded not only from Measure C, but from general fund revenues. And there was unanimous support to allocate $500,000 from the Louise Lowry Davis project to the Library Plaza project to help that project get the capital campaign sort of kick-started. And then just a minor change to allocate $95,000 for street tree planting. That's been a concern, and there was a 2-1 vote to support that, and that would just come from sidewalks. So there was no recommendation on 2 items. One, the city attorney's request, because that was going to be presented today, as you just heard. And then we talked actually a couple days ago, on the use of contingency reserve to cover a shortfall we're projecting in our sales tax and bed tax revenues. Some other items that you'll want to be considering. One, we were concerned about the fact that we potentially could be left with a $191,000 impact because of the board action in April related to administration fees for our administration of county branches. Yesterday, as you know, the board of supervisors took action to basically reverse their decision back in April. So and restoring that 13.5% admin fee. So essentially, that has been resolved from our perspective. We no longer have that shortfall to deal with. It doesn't really solve the issues of the branches who are really struggling financially. I know that the county decided they're going to be considering additional money for some of those branches that are in worse shape as part of their own budget discussions starting next week. And then there was a discussion to improve communications with library friends groups. So what staff has done is developed a P3, and we'll incorporate that into the adopted budget document we produce, which will essentially work on a strategy. P3 will be to work on a strategy for improving communications with all support groups, not just friends groups, but all groups that really support the library and tied to the library. So this is how we're going to pay for some of these things. I kind of mentioned some of them, but you can see the adjustments to the capital program are all going to be netting zero. So we're going to take money from the Louise Lowry Davis Center project. As you know, that's potentially a site for the police station. So we thought it was at least a good candidate for that, or the committee did. So shifting money for that project to the Library Plaza project, and then moving again some money from sidewalks to the street planning. And then below, funding the one-time request from Visit Santa Barbara for enhanced marketing, we propose, or at least the committee supported our recommendation to take that out of the contingency reserve since it's kind of disaster related. And the other half you don't see is the portion that would come out of the waterfront fund. And then we've talked extensively about the city attorney request. So there is the cost of the two positions, $281,000. And what we did was we just decided we're going to book some estimated revenues to cover that cost. We don't know what we're going to get next year. It could be more. Mr. Colon believes it will be more based on just on the case they're working on now with Peony. In long term, there could be some ongoing revenues. We just don't know what that number is. It's a little sort of uncertain, but I think we feel confident enough to book revenues to cover these costs from those code enforcement activities. And then for the fire department, funding the public outreach position, we are recommending, and the committee is supportive of using appropriated reserves for that. And so every year we budget about $140,000 in an appropriated reserve. It's sort of just a way to kind of provide a cushion for minor things that come up during the year. And this would take $99,000 of that. It's not unappropriated reserves. It's a sort of a line item in our budget that's just for contingencies when they come up. And so we would sort of advance or preempt that and take part of that to fund for next year at least, and then we can, sort of reshuffle the decks for 2020 and rebalance the budget. But this would be an ongoing position, at least presumably. And then this is just, I think, the final adjustment, which is to reduce sales taxes by $150,000, reduce bed tax revenues by $225,000, and then fund that just for one time only next year from contingency reserves. We believe that at the end of this year, we will end up with enough surplus, particularly because of mutual aid activity, so that we will have enough reserves above policy that this would not, in effect, come from contingency reserves. So it would actually come from excess reserves. I can't promise that. I just have a sense of that. We'll know more in September. And if we don't have surplus enough to cover this use of reserves next year, there's a potential we might see a little bit of money coming in next year from cannabis tax revenues. Hard to predict, but we know that there are 2 medical dispensaries that are going to be opening up by July 1. One for sure, one shortly thereafter. They could bring in together somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000. So, and to the extent we have any of the commercial businesses opening up anytime late this next fiscal year, that could help. So, but we're not trying to count that. We just think that that's potential to sort of offset some of this reserves. So this is sort of a summary of all those things we just talked about. So you could see kind of the bottom line is that we're going to be adding to the budget based on these proposals, $331,000 in terms of appropriations, which on a net basis, we're going to be seeing a reduction in revenues, increased revenues for the city attorney positions, but reduction in revenues for sales tax and bed tax. and on a net basis, using $425,000 of contingency reserves to make this balance. So, and then beyond that, again, it's wide open in terms of council, any parts of the budget they would like to talk about and provide direction to us. But I think the focus, of course, is going to be on these adjustments for now. Then we can move on to anything else that the council would like to talk about. And be happy to answer any questions.
Questions on this section? Anyone? Can you just go through this? Is this the last?
Yeah, so this is a summary of the detail I just went through. So the adjustment to the capital program, no impact to the bottom line because we're shifting money from one project to another within our general fund capital program. That's why you see zeros there. To the right, you see this is really primarily shifting money to the Library Plaza project, $500,000. Visit Santa Barbara is that one-time request that would come out of reserves. The city attorney positions, the two we talked about, would be funded from increased revenues. And then the impact of the Thomas Fire and debris flow would be really a use of reserves to lower our revenue estimates.
And if I could just clarify a couple things. Sure. Finance Committee on Monday recommended that staff come back with some ideas about how to fund the recommendations that came out of the Finance Committee. So this is our staff's recommendations about how to balance the books in that regard. And the $500,000 for Library Plaza would also be used towards developing the final design and a revised cost estimate. So I just want to be clear that we would begin spending some of that money in hopes that there is a fundraising campaign that could help pay for the capital cost as well.
Okay. Mr. Hart, you have questions? And we have a small stack of speaker slips, so go ahead.
Just one question. The funding for the Library Plaza, the reduction of the funding for the Louise Lowry Davis Center, I can't recall, is that a full reduction or is that a partial reduction? And what is the difference between the two and why is it not a full reduction?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hart, it could be if you would like. It was not a full reduction. Do you know?
Yeah, 371 is the balance. $371,000 is the balance.
Okay. So the staff thought process is we don't know where the police station site selection is going to go. It could go at Louise Lowry Davis, and so we felt that the target was come up with $500,000 for Library Plaza. Let's kind of put that on hold. Louise Lowry Davis renovation project, move $500,000 for Library Plaza, keep a substantial sum because if it is not at Louise Lowry Davis for police station, we think that's a high priority project to want to finish, and therefore we got to come up with $500,000 to finish that project as opposed to $800 and some thousand to finish the project. So that's just our recommendation. You could look at it differently, of course.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Dominguez?
Did we find out any more information about the staging at the museum, the construction
Museum of
staging?
Art?
No, not since yesterday or not in the last day. We continue. We will outreach to them and ask them for their input since their permit does expire in August. And I think it will help us in the conversation to have the $500,000 put aside for the Library Plaza. That will kind of force the conversation for them to come and have with us.
So my question would be, what could we do in terms of reserving that money but having it contingent on things like the Davis Center decision, the staging, and then we had talked about SB 1 taking place on the ballot in November. So is there a way that we can work this, that it's not just completely committing now and spending the money tomorrow and then finding out these three dominoes have fallen the wrong way?
Absolutely, and I'd look to council direction about how you would like us to address that $500,000. Do you want us to put it aside and wait and let those other dominoes play? Do you want us to get moving now on the final design so you have a better cost estimate? I look to council direction.
What would be a plan B where we could structure it more conservatively and set it aside but be able to not spend it if three things went the wrong way, for example?
Yeah, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Dominguez, just off the top of my head, I would think that the two key dominoes that would fall would be the expiration of their permit in August, so you would have had a chance to look at that as well, and then if SB1 qualifies, the repeal of SB1 qualifies the November ballot. Off the top of my head, I would say wait until after the November election to see if you have an issue with streets funding, and then have the item returned to council to decide how to proceed with the $500,000. Set it aside for now, but you could put it on pause until you wait and see how those two things play out.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Friedman?
So there was a discussion, I think Councilmember Hart had brought it up about the 375,000 and related to the mutual aid. So it's highly likely we're not going to get zero from mutual aid, correct? So I don't think we ever answered the question of why we wouldn't just budget the mutual aid, and then if it doesn't come in, then at that time we would take the we would consider the reserves. I would rather use that approach than the approach that's being proposed.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Friedman, so the mutual aid money we're talking about is current year mutual aid. So we can't appropriate those revenues this year into next year's budget. So even if we thought we had $1 million surplus and excess policy reserves at the end of 18, we would still be budgeting the use of reserves in 19 to fund that. So it's just whether it's going to come out of surplus reserves or policy reserves. I don't know the answer to that. Mutual aid is just one variable. We could end the year not with any surplus. Mutual aid is a big number, but we have other things going on. Sales tax, bed tax we could see further deterioration in that. I just don't know for sure we're going to end up with a surplus this year in terms of reserves. But either way, on a budgetary basis, it's going to show as a use of reserves next year.
Councilmember Snedden.
Just a quick question. Can you remind me, if we did not put the charter amendment on the November ballot, how much we would save, and when would be the best time to put that on for savings-wise?
Mr. Casey?
Gosh.
I can look it up.
Madam
too,
Mayor and
sorry.
Councilmember Snedden, exactly. I can't pull the numbers off the top of my head. There was a cost savings if you waited until November of 2019, but it wasn't as big as maybe we would have initially thought, because you don't have a citywide election in November of 19. You've got 3 districts that are up.
That's right.
So there is savings, and I think you're right, $30,000 range, was that? Yeah, I believe that was the ballpark.
Okay. Let's go to public comment. Kathy Janega Dykes with Visit Santa Barbara is first, followed by Tom Patton, Gracie Huerta, Lizzie Rodriguez. Oh, Linda Honigman is giving you her time, and Anna Marie Gott. I'm glad you were here to
Good
hear
evening.
us discuss our efforts to take care of difficult street people. I know you're here on something else, but
Yes, I am. But
Okay.
Good evening to all of you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. Thank you for giving Visit Santa Barbara this opportunity to consider a request for incremental funding. Our recovery marketing campaign absolutely needs this boost right now. We've been using every resource and relationship at our disposal to maximize our existing budget. And the 15 million impressions resulting from our multi-channel marketing campaigns in the wake of all of these disasters has not made that big of an impact, considering that we generated a minimum of over 8 billion media impressions in the U.S. alone. So our organization and the greater Santa Barbara hospitality industry are certainly concerned about the rate of our recovery at this point. And we certainly started to see some declines in transient occupancy tax revenues in April. And more urgently, we need to grow the transient occupancy tax over the remainder of 2018 to pay for all of these expenditures, and additional funds are really needed to achieve this. The infusion of what we requested, the $150,000 from the city to fund a very specific activation targeting Los Angeles residents, will give us an innovative edge. We presented that deck to you during the Finance Committee, and then we also distributed that deck as well, too. And this sort of activation will create the type of buzz that we need right now, give us the opportunity to engage directly through our consumers. And this is through a physical space as well as virtually. In terms of securing partners to offset the costs, Mr. Samario did address that, and we have received tentative commitments from several partners and plan to reach out to more partners throughout the jurisdiction. So this is really the occasion when we need to lift each other up, and we're asking the city to provide that critical boost as the most powerful entity here in the Santa Barbara County area. And we thank you for the consideration.
thank you. Mr. Rouse has a question for the
Thank you,
speaker.
Madam Mayor. Yeah, Ms. Janega Dykes. So this is going to be different because it'll be targeted specifically to the Southern California market. Is that what the drive of this is, the tip of this spear?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Council Member Rouse, what we are asking the funding for is for a specific campaign. It is targeting the Southern California market. We actually have been redirecting a lot of our marketing efforts to focus on Southern California in the wake of the disasters. This is a market that is important to the community. About 68% of our visitors come from the Los Angeles area, and we have the most opportunity to bring immediate business to the area. The campaign itself is, there are several layers to it. There's a physical space. There are opportunities to generate immediate bookings. And we're also using social media to drive interest and drive traffic to that physical space.
Well, I'm definitely all for bringing more visitors to the city. I have to ask, though, because we're being asked to go into our reserves, general fund reserves, to do this. Mm-hmm. And I know that we also have a rather large budget that we provide for Visit Santa Barbara. In your budget, and I don't know, I'm not familiar with the budget. I mean, are there reserves, and have you tapped into them already?
Yes. So we obviously do have some reserves. We have spent all of our marketing reserves to date and then some. We do have some operational reserves still in place, but it's important for us to have that to protect us in case we're facing other disasters in the near future. But we have already spent all of our marketing reserves already and then some.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. Tom Patton.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and fellow council members. Tom Patton with the Ramada Santa Barbara and current chair of the Tourism Business Improvement District. I'm here to speak in support of the VSB funding request. This benefits the city just as it does as much as the tourism industry. We've all seen the reports about the declining TOT and sales tax, and it's vitally important that we get our visitors back in our hotels, our restaurants, our shops, and recreating in our community. All these items put money back into our community through the taxes generated by the businesses and wages paid to the employees. Santa Barbara's reputation has been tarnished via the billions of images that have been shown worldwide over the past 6 months. There's still potential visitors that believe Santa Barbara is a disaster zone. We get calls on a regular basis asking if we're open and whether we've cleaned the mud out of our lobby. Visit Santa Barbara has worked tirelessly to combat these perceptions through a combination of creative marketing and advertising. Visit Santa Barbara has expended all of their marketing reserves, as Kathy mentioned, yet there are still campaigns that can be carried out and have the potential to help revive our slumping industry. I know there's concern about the City of Santa Barbara funding this request, although it may benefit communities outside of the city. However, the reality is that visitors coming to Santa Barbara know the Santa Barbara brand. They're going to be sleeping in Santa Barbara. They're going to be eating in Santa Barbara. They're going to be shopping in Santa Barbara and recreating within the city limits. In fact, 75% of the hotels in our Tourism Business Improvement District are within the city limits of Santa Barbara. Obviously, Visit Santa Barbara will continue to reach out to other jurisdictions for additional funding, but I feel it's truly imperative that the City of Santa Barbara consider the funding the full $150,000 for what it will do to restore the TOT and sales tax revenues to your budget and help our community. This is truly an expenditure that has an ROI. We appreciate the long partnership that VSB has had with the city, and we want to help our tourism community get back on their feet, and so those vital tax dollars can be restored to pre-disaster levels. So thank you for your consideration of the request.
Thank you. Mr. Dominguez?
I'm curious if either of the speakers know, I think there were a few asks to other jurisdictions pending as of when we discussed this, I guess, Monday. Did we hear any good news?
Thank you, Ms. Janega-Dykes.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, we have heard from 2 jurisdictions who have tentatively committed some dollars. We still plan to reach out to a few other jurisdictions. As Mr. Patton just noted, though, the City of Santa Barbara will be the primary beneficiary of this sort of campaign, certainly with all of the branding as well, too. But we do plan to reach out to other organizations, too.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Ms. Huerta?
Madam Mayor, council members, thank you so much for having me tonight. I wanted to speak in support of the position for Spanish-speaking public outreach for the fire department. I was fortunate enough to have a position very similar to that back in 2001, I think, to 2008. And due to budget cuts, that position was eliminated in 2008. I think that statistically, Santa Barbara seems to be having more disasters than anyone else. We know that people are not prepared for disasters. Nationwide, it's about 10% of the population is prepared. And in a community who has so many disasters, us being prepared is really important. We have about 8% of Santa Barbara County residents that are registered for reverse 911. So you can see that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, encouraging all of us to be prepared. We saw recently that our disasters not only affect our community, but they affected the larger community of California and maybe even further than that. So the work that happens here in Santa Barbara has a far-reaching effect on many residents of California. I have to put my glasses on. Adults need to hear messaging about 10 times before it creates a change. And so having someone who is full-time responsible for putting out the message of preparedness is really important to our community. Some of us who are busy and tired maybe need to hear it more than 10 times, but at least 10 times before we make a difference. I think that the percentage of our community who is Spanish-speaking is about 48%, and people who speak a language other than English is about 33%. So 33% of our residents might not be receiving information correctly in a timely manner during a disaster, and I think we saw that with this last disaster. There was evacuation information being given in English that was not being given simultaneously in Spanish, and when it was translated, it wasn't translated accurately. And so I support this position in hopes that all members of our community get timely and accurate information.
Thank you. Thanks. Ms. Rodriguez? Ms. Rodriguez, you have 4 minutes.
I feel like I've been here enough times I can have my own bingo square now. So thank you for having me here and for having this item on the budget and have it go through the entire process that it has. The time that we've spent talking online and in person, I very much appreciate. What I wanted to do today is to humanize this request. I think sometimes when we're talking about budgets, we get focused on numbers and stats and ROI, and we forget the human quality. So I wanted to tell you about when, during the Thomas Fire, and the information was being sent in predominantly English. Chief Luno was at the first Santa Barbara Town Hall meeting in Goleta, looked around and saw that there was no Spanish translation, there was no Spanish-speaking community. She texted me and said, how are we going to get this information out? Immediately, we got the wheels spinning. It was all through relationship, through grassroots mobilizing. We had our first video, and it's probably my favorite YouTube video, watching the chief of police say her name and the purpose that she's there in her very adorable Spanish. And that was great. That was great for our community to see that our city was taking a stand and making an effort. At the same time, the police were out distributing masks. The schools has closed early because of the air quality. So I think it was a week or 2 weeks before parents had planned. A lot of low-wage hourly workers didn't have a place to bring their kids. So Casa de la Raza opened their doors, and I was managing, I think, 60 kids from 5 years old to 17, and a whole lot of volunteers and a whole lot of donated food. That was beautiful. What was more beautiful and sad was when parents would come either to drop off their children or to pick them up and say, why are the police handing these masks out? What is this video all about? Is this fire really that big, or does the city really care about us? I said both. I'm hoping you can prove me right. was it 2 weeks ago, maybe last week, when I was speaking at the Fire and Police Commission, I broke down crying. There's several more people that were hoping to be here today, but they couldn't because of graduation and other family obligations. But I broke down crying because I felt humiliated. I felt embarrassed having to come and ask for support, ask for equal opportunity to critical information. It wasn't my most proud moment. I apologized a number of times, but it was a real moment. It was a moment of realizing how this basic need of emergency information, accurate emergency information, is lacked in our community. And that I'm looking to you, our community leaders, and asking you, please provide something that you take for granted because you're an English speaker. This is important. I'm glad that the CVB, or Visit Santa Barbara, is here today because they also are supporting our hospitality industry. It is our housekeepers that worked around the clock to host the Santa Barbara Police Department at the hotels when they were there. It was our maintenance crew who was supporting our fire and first responders when they were here. When our evacuated local community come to Santa Barbara because they can't go home, it is our low-wage, hourly Spanish-speaking workers. Please support them the way that they're supporting us.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Gott?
I apologize. I didn't realize I was the next speaker. First, I realize that some of the issues that you've had with your budget and staffing are because of some of the things that I have been active in, which are the short-term vacation rentals. And I know it's been a bit of a burden, but I think it is something that the city actually needed to address, and it still has a number of things that it needs to address. And I would like to really see the city become more proactive. We're very reactionary, and if we actually nip things in the bud at the beginning, I think that it would prevent a lot of the issues that you're seeing play out with regards to litigation. I would also like to just take a moment and say that we really don't have a great fines for short-term vacation rentals. There are tremendous advances up in Tahoe, which are actually requiring $1,000 as a first fine, and it just goes up from there. I think that if you're really going to be serious about this, you're actually going to have to increase fines and actually help the process more. There's a few things. I could sit up here for 20 minutes and talk. We need to do a better job when things go into ordinance. You need to dot your I's and cross your T's and kick the tires. You had AUDs that could be turned into short-term vacation rentals. There were short-term vacation rental hotel conversions that allowed people to reverse out onto the street, and that is not legal in Santa Barbara. There are a number of conversions I think that you should look at because I don't believe they've got their vested rights, and those over-the-counter permits should be revoked. There's an issue with our hotels. Do you know that our hotel rooms are actually becoming larger, and our housing units are smaller? There are actually a few projects right now.
Time is up, ma'am. Want to finish your sentence? Go ahead.
There are a few projects right now where you have hotel rooms that are 500 and 700 square feet with 2 bedrooms, 1 parking place. They resemble AUD projects. I don't think you're going to collect TOT on that. And I think that you need to look at how you actually define things a little bit better, including how you collect TOT hotel rooms and guest rooms. Thank you.
Thanks. So that closes the public comment period, and it's back to the council for deliberating. And we might finish tonight. What? Excuse me.
Would you like to take these in order, Madam Mayor? How do you want to do this in an organized way as opposed to a little free-for-all?
So if I call on you, go ahead and tell me where you stand on these different items. And Mr. Hart is first. Yeah.
Well, I would just start with the biggest picture philosophical question that I think the Finance Committee didn't get to because the additional revenue decrease was late in the game. That's just the way that it all ended up being. And so personally, I can't support using reserves. I just don't want to do that. We have been down this path before, and it was a very long struggle to get reserves back to fully funded. So I don't want to go down that path. I think there is another way, which is eliminating the funding for the Louise Lowry Davis Center fully. I think there are things that can happen over the course of the year that can change that, and there's a way staff can work with that amount to help plug this gap, and then I think we get within $46,000 or so, and I think there's other ways we can get there. The Finance Committee recommended 2-to-1 to fully fund the Spanish language outreach position. I think that's a great thing. It's a needed thing. I support it. I don't know that there's magic to full-time exactly. I think that is, this is something that's a big project that can be eased into over time. The fire department has proposed using $20,000 in the budget already. There can be something 3/4 time. There's different amounts there that can be nuanced to demonstrate that we are 100% committed to making sure that happens, but we don't necessarily need to fully invest in that. We're shaving, the Finance Committee's recommendation was to shave back some of the request from Visit Santa Barbara. I know that's difficult. We're looking for increased participation from our funding partners. The chart that showed the proportion of TOT generated by the various entities that are all part of that, I think, there we go, shows that I think there's potential for a greater contribution from some of the folks who've already committed to funding. I think that San Ynez Valley's commitment is pretty consistent with the amount that they benefit from this overall effort. City of Goleta's contribution at $10,000, I think I did the math, and their proportional benefit would suggest a $27,000 contribution. Solvang's proportional benefit would be about $13,500. Buellton's would be about $6,000. So I think there's, perhaps there's a way to go back to our funding partners and say, this is kind of the fair way to allocate that. I wouldn't suggest that we pull back our commitment to that 44% level. I think the $100,000 amount is what's is important to demonstrate our leadership and our commitment to this effort. But there is a return on investment equation in this situation, unfortunately. And investing in Visit Santa Barbara potentially generates more money than it costs. And that there is a bottom line reality to this budget process, unfortunately. The Library Plaza project actually has a return on investment as well. That is a project where we invest with our partners in the Library Foundation, with the expectation that they're going to be able to go out and privately fundraise millions of dollars to actually construct it. So that's another one that really needs to be looked at in that context. And in these days of tight budgets, when we look at things that generate revenue, not just spend money, I think we have to look at that a little differently than other projects. So that's my comment. Rather than going through these things, I guess I did hit all of them as I did it, as I rambled through. I didn't intend to. I meant to just pose the question of, if we had a chart, I forgot to ask, but we have a chart that's probably not here today, that shows how the city's reserves have ebbed and flowed over the last 10 years. And, if we go down the path of saying our first approach is to use reserves, I worry that will accelerate over time quickly. If the economy falters in any way, we could be in a very difficult situation next year. And the amount that we're talking about of using reserves is relatively modest. And there's another way to do it by just saying, we can't have everything today for next year. And pausing the Louise Lowry Davis project in light of what we're doing with the police station siting thing just seems like a better philosophical way to address that shortfall.
Mr. Hart, you don't follow the argument that the twin disasters hurt our tourism industry and that a one-time use of reserves. This is 50,000 we're looking at. And another, go ahead, Mr. Samora.
Yeah, in total, it'll be $425,000 between the impacts of the Thomas Fire and debris flow on our revenues and the use of 50,000 reserves for the Visit
okay.
Santa Barbara request.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, and so that's
So
why.
you don't see that?
No, I do see that, absolutely.
Okay.
There's no question about the impact, and there's no question that this is a worthy goal, and I support it, but we can't do everything, and we have partners that ought to be doing more, and that if everybody did their share, we'd be more than $150,000. But I think by being leaders in this effort and saying we're going to put $100,000 in, if proportionally the other people, the other local agencies contributed their share, that would be $27,000 from the city of Goleta, $13,000 from Solvang, $6,000 from Buellton, $31,000 from the county. That would be more than $100,000, I think. Yes, more than $150,000, substantially more than $150,000. So I think, we're demonstrating our commitment by the $100,000. But really, philosophically, the most important thing I want to say is the $425,000 hit to reserves is a big decision for us. And we either do that and go down that path and recognize that the loss of revenue, the $375,000 loss of revenue is an emergency, and we use our emergency reserves to fill that, or we say we need to tighten our belts a little bit, not immediately go to that place, because we will be having an emergency that we need to use those reserves for.
Okay, and if you don't mind me asking, because I think we're trying to get to decisions. So the $99,000 from the appropriated reserves for the public outreach position, I believe there's half-time money now from a different fund, and
yeah, so I would just, I could see us doing, more than what we have in the budget today. But if we are trying to get to a balance, with 425 being the number to try and reach, if we took the $371,000 that also is still in the budget for the Louise Lowry Davis project and didn't allocate that for the capital program, we could reduce that 421 by 371, and that would leave, I think, $54,000. And then if we reduced the recommended $99,000 for the Spanish language translation by that 54, we'd still have another $46,000 to add to that position with the existing $20,000. So we'd be up to about $66,000, which is a 2/3 position. That's one way to do it.
Madam Mayor, just to clarify, the $99,000 is net of the $20,000 budgeted. The position would be $119 on a gross basis, but we netted it out for the $20,000 already budgeted.
Okay, so I can't double count that. Right. So I'm back to the, half-time position plus, but not all the way to 2/3.
but you support the city attorney positions?
City attorney positions are revenue neutral. They're being paid for by the additional charge to the folks who are violating the law.
Okay, thank you for your comments, Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Going back to one of the slides that says something about the street tree plantings and reducing the funding for sidewalks by the same amount. And I was curious about that. I mean, it's not on our final list there. But curious, are those the same department, or is that streets versus Parks and Rec, or what are we doing with this?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, this is a recommendation from the Finance Committee that on a 2-to-1 vote that they wanted to see, as we roll out the streets program and pavement program through Measure C, that we also plant street trees in the streets that we're addressing. And so working with our Parks and Recreation staff, they felt next fiscal year it's about a $95,000 item. The Finance Committee, a majority of the Finance Committee, suggested that we do that. Staff's recommending that you pull that out of the Measure C sidewalk component of that program to make that work.
Well, it's a little vague. It's the idea of trying to establish trees during a drought is also something people could look askance at when we have other kinds of infrastructure problems.
Well, Ms. Zachary is here. Would you like to tell us how you balance that with the drought, taking care of new trees?
Madam Mayor and council members, the proposal here is in response to a discussion about the need to start looking at replanting our street trees. We've lost about 1,300 in the last 6 or 7 years. We developed the $95,000 number based on the plans that Public Works has to make sidewalk improvements associated with Measure C projects. That is likely probably the maximum. And so looking at the 175 trees that could be planted associated with the work that they're doing, those funds would be included in whatever contract that they would let to do that work. So it's not that it would sit in a separate fund necessarily, but the idea is as much of that could be spent planting new trees as sidewalk improvements are pursued in the next year. It shows an example of how we could get back to the street tree population we once had while we're making other infrastructure improvements in the city. That helps answer your question.
Okay, very good. Moving on to the public outreach position. Maybe I'm confusing the two jobs of the person that we just brought on in the fire department to do the halftime. But I'm thinking back, because we keep bringing up, of course, our big disasters that we just had, which were primarily a county operation, not a city operation. And while I agree that we need to be able to outreach at all times in Spanish, I'm wondering if that really is a full-time position per se. And I'm thinking back during the Thomas fire, going to the EOC and being surrounded by all the department heads and doing the press conferences and going to the press conferences and whatnot. Is that something that you're going to need to have somebody working, 5 days a week, 53 weeks out of the year doing? Is it something that's more specialized? Because I know we do bring in specialists from time to time, like Carlos Sarcedo and people like that to help translate when it's critical. And then also just having spent a lot of time with the undersheriff during the disaster, and his sense of frustration, and his sense of frustration wasn't limited at all. It had nothing to do with who spoke English and who didn't. It was the people that did not respond to information. Knocking on 1,400 doors and getting 200 people to leave. So it's hard to know how to disseminate information in an effective way, language or otherwise. So I completely want whatever we do to be either translated or whatever it takes to get to the Spanish-speaking community. But I'm not sure that I can completely justify a full-time position out of that, because I don't know if Mr. Hart brought up maybe a three-quarter time or a two-thirds time, whatever that would be. Might make sense, and maybe we revisit this again after a year. But to actually bring on a complete FTE at this point in time, I'm not sure I can support that. In terms of the Visit Santa Barbara budget, I noticed we really haven't heard about where in the waterfront this is coming from. Because I know the waterfront department, that's the 50,000 proposed from reserves, 50,000 from the waterfront department. And I know the waterfront department is looking at a reduced number of cruise ships, which is some part of the revenue. And I wasn't sure what part of, and here comes Mr. Reedman, so maybe you can help me out with this, where that would come from, or does that come out of reserves within the waterfront budget?
Thank you, Mr. Reedman.
Sure, Scott Reedman, Waterfront Director. We have some surplus reserves right now that we could take. You're correct in that our cruise ship revenue has dropped about in half at a time when we're all, our businesses that we get percentage rent from and our parking all suffered greatly from the disasters. The Stearns Wharf is entirely under budget. But we'll make it through. We have enough in reserve to make it through, and we may still get some surplus income.
And you believe you can justify that expense by helping Visit Santa Barbara do a promotion for the town? Does that make sense in your universe?
We work with them on the cruise ships. I think it's a little bit of a stretch, but I see the linkage there. We benefit from the visitors just as much as anybody.
Okay, very good. I appreciate that comment. And then that was my last.
The city attorney's positions.
Yeah, I also want to ask. Is Mr. Lichty in the audience there? I was going to ask you about. Yes, please. Mr. Case, you mentioned briefly upcoming mutual aid, or maybe Mr. Samario did. Do you have an estimate of what that may be? Any ballpark where we are in that in terms of the overall budget?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse. for this fiscal year ended June 30th, we have revenues anticipated of about $4 million and estimated costs about $3 million that we're seeing right now.
And then upcoming for the upcoming fiscal year, is that something that's not anticipated? Is that the entirety of what we have coming out of the disaster?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Very good. And then lastly, the city attorney thing. Yes, I agree with Mr. Hart that these positions. Number one, the proactive change of approach in what we're doing with nuisance crime, street crime, I think is like I said, talking to Mr. Auchincloss and some of the people who helped create this. I'm excited about it. I'm also excited about just changing it up and trying something different. And as you said, Mr. Colon, we're going to be revisiting this from time to time to make sure we can justify this. So I'm 100% on board with that.
What do you think of Mr. Hart's idea, Councilmember Rouse, of using the Louise Lowry Davis, that other 300-something thousand to backfill this?
Yeah, and like Mr. Hart, the idea of when we finally got to where we capped out our reserves again, and then find ourselves sliding backwards, and I am not an optimist when it comes to future revenues, at least for the short term, or maybe over the next couple of years. I hope I'm really wrong. But I don't want to go and start dipping now, because we had a history of that not too many years back, and it took us quite a while. I think it was like in 2008 when we really, bottomed out. So don't want to go back there. So I think that would. I'm not on finance committee, so I didn't really get to analyze it with these guys. But that does seem like a reasonable solution as opposed to going into reserves. I can see that.
Mr. Samario, our reserves are at $32 million. That's the general fund.
That's a pretty good guess. $32 million today, fully funded.
Okay, so that's one thing to consider. Mr. Friedman, you're next.
So I'm trying to understand on the mutual aid, the reimbursements that we're going to get, we hopefully will get, those, should we get them, we carry them over next year, they could be used to refill the reserves, correct?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Freeman, what we're doing is we're likely going to be accruing all those revenues into this year. So we've incurred the cost this year, and even though we may not receive the money by June 30, the invoices are out, the reimbursement requests have been submitted. So we're going to accrue that as a receivable and revenue this year in 2018. So even though cash may be next year, we're not going to be able to count it as revenue next year.
And then in terms of the proposal for the 381 from the Louise Lowry, that's part of Measure C, correct? Or was it previous?
Well, we sort of see it as one capital program with two funding sources, but predominantly from Measure C and then general fund. But it's all sort of fungible, but it's part of the overall capital program.
Okay. So that would just be used to, where would you envision using it so we don't have to go into reserves, all these? Because I would have an issue if we were using it from Measure C to backfill this. So as long as it's not from Measure C, I would support that proposal, because I do have concerns about using the reserves as well. So as long as it's not Measure C, I could support that. And then another question I had regarding the Spanish language is there was a discussion, possibly I think we discussed about maybe having a contractor come in for the first year rather than having a fully funded position. Some come in and develop the scope of work that needs to be done and possibly even look for outside grants or outside funding sources. And so they would be doing some of that work, but also building what the program is. And then a year from now, we could evaluate what exactly the scope of work is too, because I think there's some questions up here on what the level of the work needs to be. Some say full-time, members of the public are saying full-time, others maybe it's not, maybe there's other resources, how we can partner with the county. Would it be a possibility to, instead of hiring a full-time position now, to do a contractor to develop what the scope of the work they're going to do, and would that be cheaper or more cost-effective this year?
Mr. Casey.
Direction of the council as to how you want to approach this, that certainly is one approach, is to take some one-time money and bring in a consultant to look at it and develop a plan, bring that back for council consideration for implementation and future funding.
I'll put out there for consideration as we go. But that person could also, at the same time, would be working. It wouldn't just be developing a plan. They would also be working on on that this year as well. They would be performing some translation services and those types of things.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would want to go there because we have someone lined up to be the hourly halftime position that we're really excited about bringing back, and so I would hate to lose that opportunity. So I'm not sure I would want to say let's not do that and bring in an outside contractor to kind of do that work plus come up with a plan.
So we could do a contractor and the one we have now.
It all depends on what kind of money you want to put at it one way or the other.
I'm just trying to look at being more cost effective on this and get a plan that's going to specifically meet the needs of our community going forward. So I'm just throwing that out there. But overall, I'm supportive of the position. I think ultimately, one of the primary focuses of local government is public safety. So the other items, the Visit Santa Barbara, we've discussed that. I'm supportive of that effort. I don't want to be on the wrong side of wishing we would have invested more to bring visitors back to the area. So I'll be supportive of the $100,000. And then the city attorney, for the discussion we had today, I'm supportive of that. I think we need to have a new approach. And then the library, I'm supportive of going forward with the library. I'm not supportive of delaying it or waiting until these other unknowns are out there. One, we need to make a firm commitment so that the foundation can go out and raise the funds. So if the commitment was soft, they couldn't start the work of going out to their donors. So I think we need to consider that as moving forward, because if we say we're committing $500,000 now, but we're not going to spend it, and we might actually pull it away, they can't fundraise until we say we're fully in. And keep in mind that this area was a former RDA project, had $2 million towards it before the state took that away. And we've invested $8 million in other projects in that area for the Granada, for the New Vic, Libero, Courthouse Legacy. So I think $500,000 towards our own infrastructure in that area to bring it up to the same level of everything in that area is worth the investment. I think I touched on everything there.
So you don't want to use reserves. You're saying go with Louise Lowry Davis?
With Mr. Hart's proposal, I would
Pot of
prefer
money?
not to use reserves if we can avoid it.
Okay. Mr. Dominguez.
So on the city attorney, the cost recovery, how will we get cost recovery for the half that's dealing with the criminally insane, for example? Is there any cost recovery there? Is there a state grant or?
No, the cost recovery will come out of largely zoning enforcement and housing code enforcement.
So will you get full cost recovery or just the half that's doing the?
I think that what Mr. Samario is talking about is the revenue we're going to bring next year. We have accrued but not booked revenue that we will be receiving that will cover this amount. So it's bringing forward from future years revenue. So we'll meet that number, but on an ongoing basis, we can't collect 100% for the quality of life criminal cases, obviously. So you're correct. It can never be fully cost recovery, nor could I promise that ethically.
So it's going to be more the first year and then it's going to taper?
Well, we'll get a sense of what the position's actually bringing in the first year, but that revenue number is booked revenue that we haven't received.
I don't understand that now.
Okay.
We haven't hired the person, so we haven't received it.
Correct, but we have other accrued obligations that we are owed that will cover that.
Okay. And then regarding the Spanish language outreach, I'm not sure we have enough information from staff. I think that's why there's some hesitation up here, because it seems like we're describing 2 or 3 different jobs and we're describing a particular person who we have a lot of confidence because of that person's background. So it might be helpful if we had a little more clarification. One of the ideas I had, and we talked about, I don't remember if it was Monday or last week, was that this person can help citywide with Spanish language outreach, not just for fire or emergency preparation. Because one, I'm not sure what that entails when there's not an actual disaster taking place. I don't know if we're doing any training for in any language when there's not something taking place. what is it we're doing outside of a disaster in terms of training people in any language?
Well, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Dominguez, you had a couple questions there. First, the staff recommended budget is for $20,000 for a part-time hourly position to work on bilingual outreach through the Office of Emergency Services within the fire department. So that's in the staff recommended budget. This idea for a fully funded position has come as a request from the public. You all have been considering it. There's been conversations I haven't been privy to about different options and stuff, and so I'm flying a little blind about all the options that are floating around because it hasn't been staff generated, nor have you asked us to evaluate it thoroughly and bring it back. We mentioned at the fire department meeting that as this conversation has been occurring, does it live in the fire department? Does it live in the city administrator's office with our broader citywide communications? And that's something for us to discuss. I still think at this point I would leave it within the fire department. If it was a full-time position, I do think there is work to be done. As has been mentioned tonight, we used to have a position in the fire department that did broader public outreach on an ongoing basis, not only for disasters, but working with the Spanish-speaking community on disaster preparedness and CERT training and other types of stuff. And yes, we have a dedicated Office of Emergency Services that does year-round training for emergency preparation. We do training tabletop sessions, we do outreach to the community, we do a variety of programs for emergency preparedness year-round.
So there would be a full workload?
If you funded a full-time position, yes, we will take advantage of that position and use it.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure we weren't left with the impression we would find work for someone who we could hire, but there's actually work out there that wouldn't be getting done if we didn't fund this.
Yes. I've always said that this is a valued position.
Okay.
There's no disagreement with that at all. It's a financial situation, and there's lots of positions we'd like to have in the organization.
Okay. So I'm still supporting that, and in terms of what some of my colleagues have said, I'm against taking anything out of reserves or not fully funding the reserves. And I'm for the amount for Visit Santa Barbara. I think going to the library, I don't see why we have to rush ahead and make a decision today. If they have to wait a few months to fundraise, they have to wait a few months to fundraise. It's not worth going into reserves for or taking it out of another program. And if it is worth doing that, if the Davis one is the one, we'll know in a few months whether that's available or not. So we should make it contingent upon that.
So if we didn't use reserves for the Spanish language employee, then you would be okay with the half-time position?
I'm okay with the full-time position.
Okay.
And according to this, it's not coming from...
It's appropriated reserves, yeah. Okay.
It's not part of the 425. So it doesn't affect that 425,000. It's funded from an existing appropriated reserve, not from unappropriated reserves. At least that's our recommendation.
Thank you.
And then the city attorney's position, Mr. Dominguez, did you come in for a landing on that one?
If it's fully funded from revenue, I'm for it. And again, I was asking a lot of questions relating to the goals. I'm definitely for it. My district has the waterfront and a big chunk of State Street, and what used to be Casa Esperanza, where that's become a big, community firing point on homeless. So I'm definitely for this. My hesitancies were just that we've had enough planning go into it. We have some goals. Again, the court program's been there for years. We're not adding anything new into it. We're just fully staffing what we were doing before. There's no new magic, no new formula. It's just we're staffing it up with the added burden of Prop 47.
Okay. Ms. Snedden.
Thank you. Can you remind me again, is it $300,000 that we have in the wayfinding sign program? Okay, that I think that could be put off indefinitely, personally. That's $300,000 I don't feel is as important right now towards signs as could be used towards some of these other areas that we're talking about. The one that I feel the most strongly about is fully funding for full-time the outreach position. I really have to say I could not believe that we didn't already have this position as full-time. As a city our size with the Spanish-speaking population that we have, having just gone through disasters, but even before disasters, just emergency preparedness, planning, how to make an earthquake kit, how to turn off your gas line, how to do basic safety measures. That doesn't come in the midst of a disaster, that comes leading up to a disaster. All that type of training. I feel like if it was fully funded, we would have even more opportunity than we even can imagine right now. I don't think we need to be looking at the minimum of how to use such a position, but I think we don't even fully realize how much we need this position and how much it would be used. I've given the example before of it at Peabody, which has 720 students and half Spanish speaking, and before we had a full-time person dedicated just to this position, things were not translated properly. Spanish-speaking families didn't know who to go to ask the questions. It's not just pushing out and disseminating information, it's also being able to answer questions, to provide training. I think it's a sort of a basic service of our city to nearly half of our population. I don't see it as an extra or just as a result of disaster. I think it is backfilling a position that used to be here that really the recent disasters have highlighted for us that we're lacking. I wouldn't mind it coming out of the, well, it's already in the appropriated, but coming out of the sign program. I think to me that's one way we could make up a lot of this. I'm supportive of the city attorney positions. I wouldn't mind upping the Visit Santa Barbara maybe to 75,000. And really my main thing is that I feel so strongly that that outreach position needs to be full-time and fully funded.
And did you say how your position on Visit Santa Barbara, and I missed it? I'm sorry.
Oh, I think 75,000. And I also would like to not use our reserves as much as possible, other than reserves are for disasters and for unforeseen circumstances. And if this didn't call for that, I'm not exactly sure what would.
Madam Mayor, if I could just clarify with
you.
Councilwoman Snedden, the $50,000 is just from the general fund for Visit Santa Barbara. There is $50,000 from the waterfront as well, for a total city contribution of $100,000.
So you like staff recommendation on that one?
Staff recommendation on that one, yes. Thank you.
And what about Mr. Hart's idea of using the Louise Lowry Davis pot of money instead of reserves?
I'm fine with taking that $500,000 and setting it aside for one or the other and waiting until November until we see what the funding is, seeing what's happening with the police station. I wonder if $400,000 towards the library would do it. No, it has to be $500,000 to start the fundraising. Yeah, then I think the $500,000 for one or the other, I would be fine with that. Again, that one is not as important to me, so where that comes from and where it sits doesn't matter to me as much.
And city attorney positions, yes.
Supportive.
And then the last one, impacts of the Thomas Fire debris flow. You don't want that to come out of the general fund operating reserves?
I would actually be okay with a portion of that coming out of the reserves because it's a result of disasters. But if not, then I would propose $300,000 wayfinding sign program. Just put that off and take it from there.
Mr. Casey, you had an opinion about the wayfinding signs?
I do.
That they look good, and
I'm gonna speak
we should finish that project.
I'm going to speak up for the signs. We invested a lot of money in the design work. We did a lot of outreach with the business community. We have a comprehensive plan to upgrade our signs that if you ever really take a look at them, they're really not befitting a city of Santa Barbara's stature within the tourism industry. And we speak so much about wanting to improve tourism and how important tourism to us. I just, if we don't do it now, we'll never get around to finishing it, and we'll have a half-implemented program of some new signs and a bunch of old signs left. So I know it's not sexy. I know you're not going to get a room full of people here supporting it. I just think this is your one window of opportunity to get it done. I would prefer or I'd recommend doing the Louise Lowry Davis approach and let the sign program finish. If you're going to put off Louise Lowry for a year, put it off for a year, and we'll come back once we know where the police station's going to land, and we'll regroup and figure that out.
I'll support that recommendation. Sorry.
Okay. You had something to add, Mr. Hart?
Yeah, that answered it.
Oh, okay. Okay. Now it's my turn.
And Madam Mayor, if I could just say one more thing, just
Okay.
to be clear. Using the Louise Lowry Davis approach, I believe we had that funded out of Measure C. What that means, though, is that we'll move something from general fund that's clearly eligible, that's critical infrastructure, and move it into Measure C. And we'll do that as kind of the final package we bring up to you. But I just want to let you know that we'll have to toggle a few things around. But I think it's a legitimate approach, and whatever we move into Measure C, we'll make sure is a clear infrastructure priority that met the spirit and intent.
Ms. Sneddon?
Are the signs infrastructure?
Madam Mayor, the signs were in the general fund portion of it, so we'll look for something. There are other very important critical capital in the general fund capital that I think will move over fine.
I'll just keep it simple. I was, for all of this, of course, the Spanish language position, we need that. I was thinking that we could do the half-time now with the goal of making it full-time in the next budget cycle. And what Councilmember Friedman had me thinking was that the half-time person who's starting, she can do her own analysis of what's effective, right? And you don't need a contractor. That employee would be doing the work and would know, oh, this is working, this isn't working, that I would be committed to making it a full-time position next time. But I think we need to take a vote on that one because I'm sort of hearing different things about it. Obviously, our information needs to go out in English and Spanish. I think I've just switched over to saying okay from the appropriated reserves on that. I don't want to predict disasters, but we're going to have something else happen this year. And if you found this money, then it's appropriate. So I'm actually kind of okay with everything that I see here. But why don't we take it one line item at a time? And we'll just take votes that way. So what you were saying about using the Louise Lowry Davis money is, it's an okay idea, but it's taking it away from another Measure C. What did you say, Mr. Casey?
No, I don't want to put words in council's mouth, but what I'm sensing at least majority forming opinion is to, and I'll just throw that out there and see if I'm hitting it right, is to fund $500,000 for Library Plaza, using the Louise Lowry Davis capital funding to fund that, and using the remaining of the Louise Lowry capital project to move towards the impacts of the Thomas Fire and debris flow as opposed to using reserves. And you could do the first part, or just, you could do any combination of that, but I'm sensing that seemed to be where a number of people were going.
And that would be, we would keep an eye on it depending on what's happening in the Library Plaza space. Is that what I heard?
Well, and the Library Plaza question then would be, is you've had a couple different feelings about whether you move forward with it and start the final design work, or do you wait until after the November election and kind of put it in a placeholder. So we'll just need guidance from you on that.
Okay. Do I have a motion on the first item then?
I'll move that we do $500,000 for the Library Plaza to start work immediately, and move the reserves from the Louise Lowry as well.
Sorry. Who was that second? Okay, Mr. Rouse. Any other discussion on that item?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's contingent upon the Davis Center funds freeing up. In other words, that the decision is made that the police station is being built there.
No, it's now, and then we address the Davis Center later.
So how do you propose we would address the Davis Center later?
We address it later.
So it seems like you're just really dead set on having the plaza decision made today. And I know you were on the foundation as a member, so
The reason
you're really
I'm-
tight to that community, but you haven't shown any willingness to compromise at any level. So I'm just wondering if you might be able to.
The reason, I've already explained the reasoning. One is the foundation is ready to go with their campaign. And if you have donors that are willing to donate and you say, well, can you wait? And they find something else they're going to donate to, you lose that opportunity to for that donation. In addition, we've also had discussions too, and it came out with the Ortega Park. We moved that forward, but then we found out that could be a $10 million project that we don't know how we're going to fund either. So there's other projects out there that we've committed to that we have no way to fund. We have a way to fund this with a partner that has a track record of raising millions of dollars for our library, and they said they're ready to go. They came here and spoke and said they're ready to go, and they need us to tell them to go. And if we wait, they have to wait, and they could lose potential big donors. We don't know who they've talked to that said we're ready to go and we'll have something very soon, or are we going to lose those potential donors? That's why.
Okay, thank
And
you.
I think you're absolutely right that we're all excited about the project, but just too many of the things you said just sound like they're too good to be true. You know, they came to us very late in the day, so when you say they have a fundraising campaign ready to go, I'm not sure exactly what that means. It's hard to believe that they've spent years planning a fundraising campaign and didn't bring it to our attention. As in regards to they've got big donors on the hook who are ready to donate today, again, that just belies fundraising. So maybe they do, maybe they don't. They didn't tell us that. They're ready to start fundraising. I think there's a lot of ways we can reach out to them to get them excited about fundraising now. And I think they understand the reality of our economic situation. If we have a big recession or we keep having financial issues, which we see happening now, which is reality, they're probably not going to be able to raise the money necessary. Right now, we're looking at a $3 to $4 million budget. Is that the ballpark?
Mr. Dominguez, you can vote against the motion.
Let's call the question, Madam Mayor.
Okay. We need to vote on whether to call the question, and we need 4 of us to agree to call the question.
One moment, Mayor.
So just to finish my point, we don't know how much this project is going to cost. It could cost millions more than that. So to really just forge forward for a matter of saving a few months of their fundraising time is just unrealistic.
Yeah, thanks. You've had your say. So,
well, I am a member of this council, Madam Mayor.
Yes,
I mean, I don't know
yes,
why
sir.
you don't show a little respect for a few minutes of questioning.
I thought you made your point very well, right? We're going to take a vote. Let's take a roll call. No.
No,
we're just going for
Madam Mayor, it's
Call for
a
vote.
2/3 majority vote.
Okay. So you've rescinded we're just going to go forward with the vote.
No, I mean, just call the question. I said, let's vote. Get her done.
Okay.
The motion to call the question requires 2/3 vote, and then
Okay.
you'll vote on the main motion. If you get 2/3 to cancel debate right now, the calling the question is a motion to limit debate.
Okay, I'll withdraw the motion.
Helene she never went down that road, but okay, good. Thank you for that. Let's go ahead and take a roll call vote on the motion.
Councilmember Friedman?
Yes.
Councilmember Dominguez? No. Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Aye.
Councilmember Hart?
Yes.
Councilmember Sneddon?
Yes.
Mayor Murillo?
Aye. Okay, so that passes 5-1. The next one is the Visit Santa Barbara item. Do I have a motion on the staff recommendation or any other? Okay,
Second.
good. So that was Dominguez and Rouse. Any other discussion on this item? We'll take a roll call vote, Madam Clerk.
Councilmember Friedman?
Yes.
Councilmember Dominguez?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Aye.
Councilmember Hart?
Yes.
Councilmember Sneddon?
Yes.
Mayor Murillo?
Aye. Okay, very good. Next one is the city attorney positions. Mr. Hart, you felt strongly about that.
I'll
Why
move
don't you make
approval.
the motion?
Move approval.
Second.
Second by Rouse. Any other discussion on that item? Then let's do a roll call.
Councilmember Friedman?
Yes.
Councilmember Dominguez?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Aye.
Councilmember Hart,
Yes.
Councilmember Sneddon,
Yes.
Mayor Murillo.
Aye. Okay, moving along. The public outreach position in the fire department.
I'd like to make a motion to fully fund a full-time Spanish-speaking public outreach position.
I'll second.
And seconded by Mr. Friedman. Mr. Casey, just a clarification question. So that's a one-time funding, right? We're doing it because it.
Madam Mayor, if you're funding a full-time position, my recommendation is that's an ongoing operational expense. I don't want to bring a staff person on for a one-year position. So my professional recommendation would be is that it's ongoing for this fiscal year. We're taking it out of the appropriated reserves, and it's built into the base budget on a going-forward basis, just like every other position, and you'll have to address it.
Yeah, but it is one-time funding for an ongoing position.
Okay. And the employee that we have in mind, Ms. Encinas, Liliana Encinas, well respected in the community, do you think she can work full-time?
Madam Mayor, I think it'd be very inappropriate for me to answer that on her behalf.
Of course, and it's a personnel issue.
Correct.
Okay, well, that's just information I had. But Mr. Rouse, your light's on?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yeah, I think we all see the value in a position like this. I think Ms. Liliana certainly has a track record with the people she's working with now. And rather than have this be an invented position from the outside in, I'd rather see us structurally structure a position to see exactly what it is the needs and the functions are before we create a new position out of thin air. So I think it's a very fair thing to do to start out as we are with Liliana. I can't remember her last name, but Encinas, thank you. And
yeah, again, Madam Mayor, yeah.
Okay,
correct. We've got funding for a half-time hourly position.
Right, and I don't mean that this is the full-time position, but I do think that this is a partial answer to the community question. So I would like to stay status quo with that.
Okay. Ms. Sneddon, your light's on?
I would like to say that I believe it should be a full-time position if that's not fully filled by one person who's currently contracting or not. I think the position needs to be fully dedicated. So whether the personnel later, whoever fills that position, is an entirely separate issue. But I don't believe it's a new position. It's bringing back an old position.
That's right.
That was fully utilized.
Okay. I don't see any other lights, so the motion is for a full-time position. Take a roll call, please.
Councilmember Friedman,
Yes.
Councilmember Dominguez, Mayor Pro Tem Rouse,
No.
Councilmember Hart,
No.
Councilmember Sneddon,
Yes.
Mayor Murillo.
Aye. Okay, that passes 4-2. With Rouse and Hart dissenting. The final item.
Madam Mayor, should I just clarify now that the last one is sort of changed? So essentially what we'd look to do is that $425,000 use of reserves is now down to about $54,000. So because we're taking $371,000 from the Louise Lowry Davis Center project, we are basically removing that project that essentially falls to the bottom line, reduces that $425,000 to about $54,000. So that's the use of reserves now based on the decisions you made that would be left, that if you wanted to fully eliminate, that would be what's the balance left. I would say one suggestion, there is about $36,000 or so left in the appropriated reserves to cover most of that, and then we could tweak the numbers to make the balance. If the council's desire, a majority is to not use reserves or show the use of reserves, we could make it happen between appropriate reserves, a decision already made on the Louise Lowry Davis Center project, and just finding that extra $10,000 somewhere else. That's just noise.
Okay, so what would a motion sound like, Mr. Samario?
The motion would be to have us balance the budget so there's no use of reserves, using appropriated reserves and other minor tweaks to make that happen.
I'll make that motion.
That's Friedman.
Second.
Rouse is a second. Any discussion on that item? We'll take a roll call, Madam Clerk.
Councilmember Friedman,
Yes.
Councilmember Dominguez, Mayor Pro Tem Rouse,
Aye.
Councilmember Hart, Councilmember Sneddon?
Yes.
Mayor Murillo?
Aye. Okay. So, Mr. Casey, did we get to everything? And so we don't need another budget discussion on the 12th? But I would like to compliment our staff, the budget staff and everyone, Mr. Kalan, for you to be so successful in addressing the Dario Pini situation. And this kind of ties in with what Councilmember Dominguez was saying. We need to know all your successes. So if you and the chief launch that program, it sounds like you will, please let us know so that we know that this money is well spent. I see our parks director out there. Thank you for launching the Ortega Park planning process, and Dwight Murphy, our libraries. I'm just so proud of everyone. And I think sometimes that gets lost in budget discussion, that our employees work hard and make our city proud. So, I think we're done, unless anybody else has anything else. This meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Okay.